The reading this morning is by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It's from his Nobel Prize speech given in 1964 upon his award of that prize. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam on the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding of events that surround him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why temporarily defeated right is stronger than evil triumphant. I believe that even amid today's mortar bursts and whining bullets, there is still hope for a brighter tomorrow. I believe that wounded justice lying prostrate in the blood-flowing streets of our nations can be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men. I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe that what self-centered men have torn down, men other-centered can build up. I still believe that one day mankind will bow down before the altars of God and be crowned triumphant over war and bloodshed, and nonviolent redemptive goodwill proclaimed the rule of the Lamb. And the lion and the lamb shall lie down together, and every man shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid. I still believe that we shall overcome. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who was the queen of an island. All right, hang on. That's the kid's story, and we're in the grown-up part of the service. But sometimes it takes simple stories to make complicated things obvious. One day the Queen's Secretary of Defense came to her and said, "Your Majesty, the people on this island are the greatest people in the world. We are exceptional above all the others. But we must beware of the people on the next island. They are our enemies." "Our enemies," responded the Queen. "How terrible." "Yes, it is terrible," said the Secretary, "for our little island will never be safe while we have enemies. We must find a way to rid ourselves of our enemies." "You're quite right," said the Queen, "but do you have any ideas about how to do that?" "I do indeed," said the Secretary. "We can take our army, put them on our ships, and sail to the other island, march on shore, and destroy our enemy." "Oh dear. Will any of our soldiers or sailors be killed?" "Undoubtedly. But their sacrifice will make our island strong, and we will erect great monuments to the defeat of our enemies and to remember their bravery." The Queen was not entirely sure if this was a good idea. She said, "Thank you for sharing that, but I need some more time to think about it. Could you come back tomorrow morning?" "Yes, Your Majesty," said the Secretary as he bowed himself out. The next day when the Secretary came back, he was shocked to find the Queen having tea with the Queen of the other island. He turned red with anger. "How can you sit there and drink tea with that woman? She is our enemy. We must rid ourselves of our enemies." The Queen looked at her Secretary with eyes that were calm and steady. "You've been a good secretary And you were right, we have to get rid of our enemies. You would have me destroy our enemies by conquering them with our army. The best way to get rid of our enemies is to make them our friends. That's a simplistic tale. But consider the ongoing controversies about how to approach our negotiations with Iran over their nuclear program, whether to tighten the strength sanctions and threaten war, or to try to negotiate an agreement that will consider the interests in both sides of the conflict. Think about the pressure to attack Syria after the chemical weapons attacks, the drums that were beating for war versus a choice to accept the decision of Syria to give up their chemical weapons. Now, nothing is perfect, but I will tell you that I believe that decision was better than going to war in Syria. And it's become possible after more than 55 years for our president to shake hands with the president of Cuba, though not without criticism. Gonna shake hands around the world. Think about Nixon in China in 1972. Nixon, who made a career of anti-communism, denouncing those who had lost China to the communists, the threat of Quemoy and Matsu that he brought up in the 1960 presidential election, the dangers of Red China. Nixon, astonishingly enough, Nixon in 1972 went to China and met with that arch foe, that apotheosis of evil, Mao Zedong. Even Nixon was able to take the Queen's example rather than the Secretary of Defense. Never does hatred cease by hating in return. Only through love can hatred come to an end. This is an ancient and unalterable law. Martin Luther King Jr. placed himself decisively on the side of those who stood for peace in Vietnam. He argued the case against the war on April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day before his assassination in Memphis. It was an address to a gathering of laity and clergy concerned about Vietnam. The speech, A Time to Speak Out, was controversial and prophetic. And even today it can seem shocking in the forthright criticism, not just of the war, but of American foreign policy in general. It's been largely forgotten, and it's not often remembered as we celebrate this day and tomorrow in memory of Martin Luther King and his life and his work. But it seems appropriate at this time when voices for war are raised, Syria, Iran, that we should remind ourselves of King's other legacy. He started his remarks by listing the reasons that he felt compelled to speak out. Because the costs were starving funding for the anti-poverty programs that had been created in part to counter the consequences of centuries of enslavement, segregation, and oppression. Because African Americans were dying in disproportionate numbers in the war. Because the war was undermining his own efforts to prevent violence in the inner cities. He promoted his doctrine of nonviolence in the ghetto, but the angry young men, he said, asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problem, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their question hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. He said that his calling as a minister compelled him to proclaim the message that Jesus had proclaimed. That calling raised his eyes above national allegiance. He continued, to me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I'm speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men? For communists and capitalists, for their children and ours, for black, for white, for revolutionaries, and for conservatives? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? Those were tough words in 1967, and they're tough words today. King was widely denounced for standing up against the Vietnam War. He was told he had no place speaking out, that his purview should be restricted to the struggle for civil rights, that he was putting the interests of America's enemies above those of his own nation, blaming America first, as some of our contemporaries might put it, and that he would no longer be welcome in the corridors of power. Never does hatred cease by hating in return. Only through love can hatred come to an end. This is an ancient and unalterable law. Great interests stand against any attempt at peace. Small arms exporters have managed to prevent the approval of an international arms trade treaty to reduce the export of weapons into conflict areas. Much of our supposedly humanitarian foreign aid is actually used to sell weapons and line the pockets of military contractors. When will peace come? When there's less profit in war than in peace. Great interests stand against peace, pride, fear of seeming weak, a belief in American exceptionalism that favors our interests over those of every other nation. Consider, for example, the accusations of weakness launched against our president for choosing negotiated solutions in Syria and Iran. When will peace come? When nations can swallow their pride and they follow the way of the young queen, not the way of her Secretary of War. If only we could abolish greed and selfishness and pride. If only everyone were as enlightened as we are. Wow. That's a tall order. If we could just order everyone to get rid of their greed and selfishness, it's all their fault, really. Martin Luther King Jr., in his commitment to nonviolence, recognized that peace starts from me, from the choices I make, that peace cannot be won by force. Forcing you to be nonviolent is, well, aside from being futile, it's forcing. Nonviolence means giving up forcing and coercing. I want to tell a couple of stories about the struggle against violence and war from our own Unitarian and Universalist traditions. We can trace the development of nonviolent civil disobedience in the modern world to the example of Henry David Thoreau, friend of our great Unitarian sage, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thoreau refused to pay the tax to support the Mexican War, a war that had as its intent the expansion of slavery. And then we can trace the development of nonviolence through Aidan Ballou, founder of the utopian Hopedale community near Milford, Massachusetts. Ballou had served as both a Unitarian and a Universalist minister, and he taught that turning the other cheek meant that Christians must not ever engage in violence, no matter how righteous the cause. His doctrine of Christian non-resistance, as his most famous book was titled, led him to oppose even the Civil War, despite his own deep revulsion over and hatred of slavery. We can trace the development of this doctrine next to Leo Tolstoy in Russia. He read Ballou's book and responded to it with his own defense of nonviolence. He called his book The Kingdom of God is Within You, and he initially meant it as a preface to the Russian edition of Ballou's book, but it grew and grew and grew and became a book on its own. And when Mahatma Gandhi went to London to study law and later in South Africa, his Christian friends pressed many books upon him and tried to get him to convert to Christianity. But Tolstoy's book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, was the only one that he felt contained the true teachings of Jesus, that you must not strike back, nor must you allow yourself to be turned aside. John Haynes Holmes, long the minister of our Unitarian Community Church in New York, was a thoroughgoing pacifist during World War I, at a time when patriotic fervor swept through the land and when every civic leader was expected to endorse and support that great struggle the war to end all wars. But Holmes refused to allow a recruiting station to be set up in his church. He refused to allow bond sales, and he even managed to avoid having the American flag flown in the sanctuary. The church is a different place. It's not subject to the nation's needs. He led a council of Unitarian leaders who considered the choices before the American Unitarian Association in responding to the war. They gave their report to the General Conference of 1917. The majority sided with the idea that the association should support the war, but they also agreed that the peculiar genius of the Unitarian movement is its support for the right of the minority to express its opinion. They said, certainly it would be difficult to name our reason for being if the privilege of nonconformity were denied or even threatened among us. By tradition and by practice, we are dissenters. The cause of all dissent is our cause. Holmes then, in his speech to the floor, recalled William Ellery Canning's remarks at the outset of an earlier war. The cry has been that war is declared and all opposition should therefore be hushed. In the days of the war against Britain in 1812, he continued, a sentiment more unworthy of a free country can hardly be propagated. But at the conference, William Howard Taft, President and later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was the president and presiding officer of the conference. He forcibly denounced Holmes' pacifism, and he ran through a bellicose endorsement of war which passed overwhelmingly. And then, in April of 1918, the Board of Trustees of the American Unitarian Association voted to deny financial support to any church whose minister was not a wholehearted and enthusiastic proponent of the war. Of 15 pacifist ministers who occupied pulpits in Unitarian congregations before the war, only 7 survived to the end, among them Holmes. Holmes learned about Gandhi in 1918 and brought him to Americans' attention in 1921 in a controversial sermon named, "Who is the Greatest Man in the World?" He would have appreciated this lighthearted take on Gandhi's nonviolence from a book by several of Gandhi's admirers named Dear Gandhi, Now What? Dear Gandhi, what if you were alone with your grandmother and she were viciously attacked by a heavyweight boxer armed with brass knuckles? Would you remain nonviolent? Sincerely, Earnest Truth Seeker. Dear Ernest, following grandmother's warning, I would pull her shag rug out from under the attacker's feet as he crossed the threshold. That would cause him to fall, so that his chin would come to rest comfortably on the far side of the little pillow that grandmother rests her feet on. The brass knuckles would fly through the air and rest harmlessly in the kitchen sink, and grandmother and I would then offer our chagrined visitor some tea. If that doesn't work, grandmother has some other ideas too. Nonviolence demands creativity. Gandhi. Gandhi wasn't able to prevent the violence that broke out at the end of his life in the bloody partition of India and Pakistan, and he was assassinated by a fanatic in that conflict. But he had planted a seed that came to flower after his own death. We can trace that seed through Howard Thurman, who had gone to India, the first African-American dean at Marsh Chapel, Boston University. He realized that the techniques of nonviolence could also be applied in our country. And when Martin Luther King was in Boston studying for his doctorate, he took Thurman as his mentor, learned from him, among others, about how to apply Gandhi's teaching. And then, of course, he was able to put those teachings in practice starting in 1956 during the Birmingham bus boycott. Nonviolence doesn't always work. But the recent death of Nelson Mandela reminds us that forgiveness works, that reconciliation works, and that nonviolence can work. When will peace come? We have a hymn in our Teal hymnal that puts it this way: If every woman in the world had her mind set on freedom, if every woman in the world dreamed a sweet dream of peace, if every woman of every nation, young and old, each generation, held her hands out in the name of love, there would be no war. The hymn goes on to say, if every man, if every leader, if every nation in the world set a true course for freedom, if every nation raised its children in a culture of peace, if all our sons and all our daughters reached in friendship across the waters, refusing to be enemies, there would be no more. If only. We will not in our time see the end of war, but we can plant little seeds in our own lives. We can nurture the seeds planted in our tradition by Henry David Thoreau, Aidan Ballou, John Haynes Holmes, and many others, and by Tolstoy, Gandhi, Thurman, Martin Luther King Jr. We can bear in mind that war changes those who wage it and take care to offer restitution to our troops, to their families, and to the communities that have been scarred by the wars we have been waging. We can bear in mind that war changes nations and that there's always work to be done to ensure that our nation follows the wisdom of the little queen in our story and not the way of her secretary of war making. Never does hatred cease by hating in return. Only through love can hatred come to an end. This is an ancient and unalterable law. When will peace come? It'll be a long time. But we remember that Martin Luther King also died knowing that the road would be long. The night before his assassination, he spoke of threats to his own life as he arrived in Memphis. And then he said, I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. How long? We cannot know. What we do know is that there's work to be done. Work to be done in our own hearts and minds. Work to be done in our communities. Work to be done in our nations. Work to be done to persuade our leaders to follow the way of the little queen and not her secretary of warmongering. If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.